How's it going? So, this video is about demonology misconceptions. My name is Preston. I main a demonology warlock in Legion. I know. What's wrong with me, right? Why would I ever do that to myself? Why would I ever subject myself to this spec, right? When there's destruction and affliction out there, which seem to pull really good. So that's the main misconception. The numbers for demonology are actually really good. It pulls good damage. Oops, shit, just wasted a cooldown. No big deal. I just bumped my button. But the main misconceptions with demonology honestly aren't about the damage. I think nobody really argues that. You know, you'll see a demonology warlock that pulls really good damage, and you'll look at logs, and there's like there's like I think thousands of affliction players, and there's only a handful of us who still play demonology. And the reason for that is that Blizzard has done a terrible job of explaining to the players how do you play this class. And now I could blame it all on Blizzard, but honestly, part of it is just a weird assumption. And the main misconception is, now I'll go in and I'll make a guide on how to actually play this class, but I'm just gonna tackle the first couple misconceptions on how to play this character, or this class. I'm not going to touch on legendaries yet. I'll do that later, and I'm going to try not to ramble on too much, which I'm really bad at. But everyone seems to be misinforming each other. There's a lot of guides out there already. Why would you watch mine over someone else's, right? Of much higher production value. A lot of those high production values are just straight up misinforming you, to be completely honest with you. Like, not to point fingers, but I recently watched Bellular Gaming's video on Warlock, and he's just he's casual. He's not hardcore mythic progressing rating, and I'm not accusing him of being really bad at the class or anything like that. And it's not his fault. He thought the things he did about demonology spec. He covered destruction and affliction, I think, pretty well, and he was just judging how fun is this class to play. And in watching his video, I realized just how bad this problem is, that people just don't know how the spec works on a very fundamental level. And that's why I'm making this video. And the number one thing I see a lot of new demonology players do, and one of the big mistakes they make, is with Doom. And really, it's this weird misconception that Doom behaves differently than any other damage over time, when really it's just like any other damage over time in the game. It's not. It does have some unique qualities to it that if you really want to min-max it, you can take advantage of. It's actually one of the only damage over times in the game that you can still snapshot, which is amazing. And a very skilled demonologist is going to take advantage of that. But as someone, if you're new to demonology and you just kind of want to get in there and start messing with it, just kind of being like, oh, I've been playing Affliction all Legion, I'm getting kind of bored, let's try demonology out. If you're that kind of player, because I know you're out there, you're getting bored of hitting Drain Soul over and over again, and you kind of want to try something new, and you're kind of looking at demonology as maybe something new, and you're confused. So, it is kind of Blizzard's fault, in a way, but because Doom's weird. It's a weird spell. So let's put a pet on passive real quick. The misconception is, if you haven't heard this, maybe you thought this, and maybe you don't even know what I'm talking about, is that Doom does no damage until it runs out. That is what it looks like. It says, and when it expires, that's when its damage happens, right? So if I hit Doom, and you look at the target, and you look at, I've got details up right here, and you should be able to see that. I haven't done any damage yet. I'm sitting here, it's been sitting there ticking. It hasn't done any damage yet. Then there it is. It ticks off, hits a bunch of damage, and I gain a soul shard. And I'm like, alright, that's how it works. Now that it's run off, let me put it back on. That's what people do. And I can kind of see why they think that this is how it works. But it's not. So if you read it, it says, inflicts impending doom on the target, causing shadow damage after 14.8 seconds. That's all it says. Now, something you have to take into account. Now, I'm just going to summon some imps here, just to get rid of my soul shards. Something you have to take into account is that it is still a damage over time, and that means it follows all the same rules. If you're coming from Affliction, this is your agony. This is agony. Don't treat it any different. Don't put it on targets that aren't going to last a long time. Don't put it, you can literally treat this just like you do agony. So, let's just get rid of the soul shard here. And, I can right-click these? No, I can't. Okay, whatever. We'll just wait for them to run out. So I'm going to put Doom on the target. I'm out of soul shards. And I'm going to prove to you that you can refresh this dot just like any other dot before it runs out. And it still takes into account Pandemic. I just refreshed it. Now in 3 seconds, 2, 1, tick. It ticked. And it's still on the target. And it's going to have another tick here in a few seconds. I can keep refreshing this dot. This is a major misconception because it hits at the very core of what the class is. You still have a dot. This is a dot you keep up 100%. 100% uptime. This is one of your soul shard generation mechanics that you have. If you're going to play the spec, you have to. Because Doom actually is a decent chunk of your damage, believe it or not. It is. Aside from your imps, it's up there, especially on 2 to 3 target. You don't really use it on crazy multi-targets situations. But on a fight like Demonic Inquisition, yeah, Doom is going to hit pretty up there in your priority list. And knowing how this spell works is very important. I mean, you saw there, it just hit for 1.2 million. That's a pretty good hit. And it's soul shards. So... And with the current UI, if you're running in default UI or you're not running a ton of weak auras, there's no way to properly track when it's going to tick. There are weak auras, there's add-ons that can track these sorts of things, but at the default, there is no way to know. Other than, when it runs out, that's when it ticks. That's not how it works. It just so happens that its default duration equals the tick timer. Does that make sense? Is that a better way to... I think that's a better way to put it. This is why you can dot snapshot with Doom. Because haste affects how long... how quickly your dot ticks, right? Now, what's weird about Doom is that it does snapshot your haste when you put it on there. Because its duration is equal to its tick value, and its tick value is going to be determined by your current haste. So you can actually, with Lust, snapshot your Doom. So that's the main misconception. That is the number one misconception I see with demonology guides, demonology video. Like in Bellular's video, he said it doesn't tick until it's off, and I left a paragraph comment. I'm sure he's never going to see. He's probably never going to see this video. I don't care. He's doing great work. I love his videos. But anyway, I just wanted to point that out, and maybe a few people see this video and notice, oh, okay, Doom, I should just treat it like I do any other dot, any dot or a dot that works like Agni. I mean, when you're doing like Mythic Plus or something like that, you're not fighting a boss, you don't typically put it up because, like I said, it's not going to do any damage until 14 seconds later. Then it does all its damage. So you have to think, is this mob going to last like 20 seconds? If not, don't even bother. You know what I mean? Uh, so that's the main misconception. There's a couple other misconceptions, but that's the number one misconception. If you can learn Doom and then most of what the other guides say are correct. Now, if you're completely new to demonology, you don't know how it plays at all, and this is all new information for you, I'll cover the basics. So, demonology is a very weird spec to play compared to other specs. You know, you have builders and spenders, and that's about what the other specs play like. This one, it's more of a set of priorities and decisions you have to make based on those priorities and the situation you're in. In a way, it's very formulaic, but it's also dynamic, if that makes sense. Um, so, like I said, Doom. That's a prime example. You don't want to cast Doom if the target's not going to last long enough. And you also don't want to refresh Doom if it's not going to last long enough. You know what I mean? Now, you have your soul shards, right? Yeah, that now they've done a good job, I think, in that, and that's that unifying all the specs. All warlocks use soul shards now. I think that that's actually good for most players. Now, how you generate them is different for every spec, so that can be kind of confusing. But for demonology, soul shards are more like combo points for a rogue than they are like for destruction or affliction. So most of our damage comes from summoning things or the minions themselves. So there's a main thing you need to worry about is demonic empowerment. There's some misconceptions about this spell as well, but that's we won't get into that just yet. So the main spells, I'll just go through our main spells. So our main spells are Shadowbolt, Doom, Call Dreadstalkers, Hand of Gul'dan, and Empowerment. And we have our artifact ability. But so it's really 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 buttons for most situations. Those are your basic buttons. So we already covered Doom extensively, so you know how that's going to work. You keep it up on the target all the time on bosses and on trash mobs, only if they're going to last a long time. Now, Call Dreadstalkers has a short 15-second cooldown. You pretty much want to cast that on cooldown, so you want to make sure you have at least 2 soul shards to do so, because it costs soul shards. How do you generate soul shards? So obviously Doom, when it ticks, we give a soul shard. That's sort of our semi-passive way of generating soul shards. Now the other way you generate soul shards is Shadowbolt. So when you cast Shadowbolt, you generate a soul shard. The misconception here is that Shadowbolt is our filler spell. Oddly enough, Shadowbolt is not our filler spell. In the current meta in rip meta, but in the current metagame, that is Demonology. So this is the current go-to build for Demonology, and that's where you pick Shadowy Inspiration, Improve Dreadstalkers, anything here, honestly, because that's a defensive tier. Power Trip, Service, and Soul Conduit. So level 90. So for level 75 and level 45, that's personal preference. Demonic Circle usually, and Burning Rush to for movement capabilities. But the misconception is that you cast Shadowbolt to generate your soul shards. You don't. You do, but you don't. The misconception here is that demonic empowerment. So what most guides tell you to do is every time you summon something, you hit demonic empowerment, and then you're building up with Shadowbolt, and then you're summoning, and then you're buffing. That's kind of true, but it's also very not true. So since the release of Tomb and the release of the release of Concordance and the new gold trait, this has changed Demonology's playstyle immensely because of Falkiel's ascendance. What this does is whenever you cast Demonic Empowerment, there's a 50% chance to enrage Thalkiel, causing each of your pets. Now you summon a lot of minions. Think about that. To deal shadow damage to their current target. And that says 41k. That sounds super low. But believe me, when you get up there, when your haste values and stuff, you have a ton of pets, that becomes way more damage than Shadow Bolt. And you might be saying, well, that doesn't make any sense. You still need to cast Shadow Bolt to generate shards, right? Not exactly. Because of Power Trip, you don't. Demonic Empowerment has a 65% chance to generate a Soul Shard when you cast it in combat. That pretty much means that at certain situations, you're never going to cast Shadow Bolt. You're just going to use Empowerment as your filler, not Shadow Bolt. Now, you have to get up to that point before you start doing that. And once again, this is a part where Blizzard utterly fails. You need a weak aura or an add-on to track this, because it's worth using Empowerment as your filler when you are at 13 or more minions, or around that many minions. When you are below 13 or more minions, you will be casting Shadow Bolt, but you will never be casting it like this. You don't cast Shadow Bolt by casting Shadow Bolt. You never do that. Why? Because it's still more DPS to empower and then use the instant Shadow Bolt that you get. Why? Well, for a lot of reasons. One, it makes it easy. You never have to really worry about your empowerment ever falling off. So there's that. But the other thing is, Empowerment is faster casting than Shadow Bolt. And causes damage. You know? So it's actually better to empower Shadow Bolt, like that. So you hit Empower, then you hit Shadow Bolt. That's faster and more shards per second. Because even though you're not getting as much damage because you're not at 13 or more minions, you're still getting the 65% chance to generate a soul shard when used in combat. From that, plus it's faster because you're basically, this is, so at my current haste, it's 1.1 second cast versus a 1.48. So plus, you know, there's kind of a global cooldown, but not really. It's instant right after, you know. It's kind of weird how that works. I think if you do the math, it works out to be the same cast time as if you were to just cast Shadow Bolt once, but you aren't getting the 65% chance to get an extra soul shard. If that makes sense. If I was Blizzard, I'd redesign it to just say Shadow Bolt casts this for you, but we're not living in that world right now. So so that's going to be how you cast. When you are below 13 minions, you empower and then you Shadow Bolt. Always. You never hard cast Shadow Bolt like that. Ever. You never cast it that way. There's almost no situation where you're going to want to do that. If you do that, it's probably because you lagged and misclicked. You know? So now we know how to generate our soul shards correctly. Now, how do we spend them correctly? Now, when you look at your breakdown on damage for a Demonology Warlock, almost all of your damage comes from your imps. But I said, you gotta keep an eye on Dreadstalkers. Dreadstalkers don't do much damage, to be honest. The thing is that they have this talent, that when you summon it, it gives you 2 imps. So if you think about it, Hannigal Dan summons up to 4 imps. 4 imps, 4 soul shards. Having this says 2 soul shards, 2 imps. Plus 2 doggies that kind of help. It also puts a debuff on the target. That debuff makes, 20, makes it so that your imp's firebolt do more damage to that target. So you kind of want to make sure that's up. But if you're hitting this on cooldown, it'll pretty much be up near 100%. So you don't really have to worry about it too much. But keep in mind that this is one of the disadvantages of playing Demonology, is you don't have direct control over all these tiny minions, meaning that you can't target switch very easily. But regardless, imps are where all your damage comes from. You want to keep in mind how many minions you have. There is a weak aura you can get that tracks them. I don't know where it is, but right here on my UI, next to this add-on here, which is Doom Shards, I will have a number showing how many minions I have. Currently it says 1, then it says 5. And you see I'm hitting Empowerment, then Shadow Bolt, refreshing Doom before it ticks off, and then I summon my big dudes, and then I use my artifact ability. I'll touch on that in a minute, but I just want to show you what it looks like to do this properly. I actually let Doom tick off there, which is bad. So I have more... See, I have like 19 minions, so I start spamming Empowerment. You want to keep an eye on your imp timers and these sorts of things. This is just a totem bar. That is in the default UI. I've just moved it down. So good on them for having that. There's just no telling exactly how many minions you have. So yes. So yeah. The other main core mechanic in your spec, and I kind of fucked it up by doing it without explaining it, is your artifact ability. So your artifact ability, it reads, Stalkiel drains 8% of the life from your Deviant Servants and unleashes a blast of shadow damage at your current target equal to the life he stole. Sounds really cool, right? What it basically means is the more minions you have out, the more damage it does. And if they're empowered, because empowerment buffs their health value, it's going to hit harder. So, ideally, you want to use this when you've got your Grimoire Felguard out. You can't really Grimoire anything else. Grimoire Felguard. Felguard has the most health, does the most damage. You don't really have an option there. You can't use it for utility, as much as that would be useful. You can't really use it for its utility. You have to use it as a damage cooldown. And your Doom Guard. You summon both of those. You have some minions out. You buff them all. You hit the button. That's typically what you want to do. With a caveat. You must make sure you have at least 10 minions out before hitting that button. Or it's not worth hitting. Because there is a sort of soft cap at about 10 minions. Once you get above 10 minions, it does help the damage still, but they kind of put a soft cap on it, sort of a nerf, just to... so it wouldn't get too out of hand with the current legendaries, like Awakener's Loyalty. So you want to make sure you've got at least 10 minions out, and some of those minions are some of your more powerful demons. And they're buffed. Then you hit it. Maybe if you have a trinket proc too. Because that ability can hit like a truck. Especially if you have Awakener's Loyalty. So if you don't know what Awakener's Loyalty is, it's one of the best in slot legendaries. For Helm slot, the other best in slot is the Shoulders. You might be wondering why I'm not using that. That's just because, personally, I prefer the Ring. Just because it lets me line up Falkel's consumption more often. But every soul shard you spend with Awakener's Loyalty makes your next artifact ability do 3% more damage for every soul shard you spend. So you use that, plus Soul Conduit, plus Power Trip, plus Inspiration. You are generating and spending soul shards left and right. It caps at 50, which is 150% extra damage. So, there's two ways to do this. One, you can wait until the God moment, where you've got 50 stacks, all your shit out, and then you crit, and it hits for like 40 to 70 million damage. Not an exaggeration. It can hit that high. It doesn't normally, but it can if the planets align. That's how I would describe demonology sometimes. You are slowly forcing the planets to align for a extremely powerful artifact ability. But usually it hits like a steamed noodle, a wet noodle. It's not really that bad, but it still doesn't hit like what you would want it to. It stings a bit. Uh, Usually I'd say it hits like 8 million damage. Say my average one is like 8 million damage. The crits, maybe it's in the 15 mil range. It's on a 45-second cooldown. So you want to make sure you've got at least 10 minions out every 45 seconds, which you should be doing. Now, that's the core mechanics, core rotation. Alright, that sounds great. But that's great for Simcraft, right? But how do you play this thing when you're out in the world? How do you play this when you're in a dungeon? How do you deal with moving out of mechanics? So, in some weird ways, you're lucky. You know, some people are like, oh, demonology is rooted to the ground more than the destruction. That's not true. You just have to realize that your disadvantages are also your strengths. So one of the main disadvantages of demonology is that playing this build where you're demonic empowering and then you're shadow bolting doubles your mana cost of your abilities, which means you're going to have to life tap a lot as a demonology warlock. And that sounds bad, right? That's a lot of wasted global cooldowns. But if you plan it right, you can use your life taps while you're moving. So you can burn all your mana if you know a movement phase is coming up, and then life tap while you're moving, and then when you're back to not having to move, continue some imp spamming. The other thing is, well, Shadowy Inspiration. Your next Shadow Bolt is instant cast. You know, so if you can kind of do this sort of, you know, watch your global cooldown and that sort of thing. You can kind of like inch yourself to where you need to be, without actually losing any damage if you do it correctly. The other thing you can do while moving is Demon Wrath. Demon Wrath does not hit hard unless you have a lot of minions out. It's your multi-target. This is your AoE ability. And Demon Wrath has some issues. But you can hit it while you're on the move. I wouldn't recommend it until you are full mana, you've refreshed Doom, you've already used your instant cast Shadow Bolt, and you're still on the move. So basically, if you've got nothing else to cast, you've run out of options, then maybe Demon Wrath, and you might proc a free Soul Shard or something. Because Demon Wrath procs Soul Shards. Which is interesting. It's probably the only spec that can generate more Soul Shards with its AoE, which is interesting. But anyway. So yeah, I guess that's kind of a terrible segue into how to AoE as the class. So, Hand Gul'dan, you're still summoning imps. And they do single target damage, so you're like, okay, but that doesn't really help for AoE. So when you cast Hand Gul'dan, which summons the imps, the meteor does hit decently hard, and it does hit in a small area around the target, 8 yards. So you see here it says 500,000 damage in an 8-yard radius around the target. So on really shitty mobs, like mobs that are not going to live very long, you don't have to hit Hand Gul'dan at full. Like, basically, if the mob is going to last less than 10 seconds, or less than 5 to 10 seconds, that's what I call, like, really shit mobs. Those are the kinds that Soul Flame annihilates, those sorts of things, and you want to get a little bit of damage on there. You don't have to cast Hand Gul'dan at full 4 shards. The damage doesn't scale, and it'll hit decently hard. But generally speaking, this is how you do it. You send your pet in there. He does cleave damage automatically, and he has his little whirlwind ability, Wrathstorm or Fellstorm, depending on if you have a character glyphed or not. There used to be a bug with it, but don't worry, the bug should be fixed now. But regardless. So you want to cast Hand Gul'dan as kind of your shard dump in AoE situations. And most of the time, this is what you're going to do. And really, you're still going to do single target damage for the most part. And if the mobs are stacked, you're going to be doing a little bit of cleave with Hand of Gul'dan. When there are, I'd say, a lot of people say 3 or more targets you want to be doing like your AoE rotation. Personally, I think 3, I'd say 4 to 5 targets. Even with 3, it's really not worth. But you want a Demon Wrath basically as your filler. And something to keep in mind with Demon Wrath. So Demon Wrath, you can do this while moving, which is awesome. And it generates you soul shards. What it does is it radiates an AoE around each one of your minions. Which is awesome, but also has its problems. And this is kind of a design issue. And hopefully they'll address it in the next expansion. I don't expect them to patch it anytime soon. Your imps spawn in melee range to whatever you summon. But they have a 40-yard range, which means they're not going to follow the target. And some minions, they spawn next to you. So there's a lot of wasted Demon Wrath damage because, you know, it radiates around your minions. So that's where the AoE happens. So if you summon a Doomguard, just, you know, right there, and it's just going to stand there and it's going to hit nothing, essentially. There's a few ways you can counteract that. You can go into melee range if you can. If you really want to. I don't recommend it most of the time. If you really want your minions to spawn next to it. Luckily, this doesn't work like... Demon Wrath does not work like, say, Thalkiel's Consumption. It doesn't matter what minions you have. It just goes off of the count. It doesn't matter if they're empowered or not. It just radiates the same damage from every minion. Something to keep in mind with this is that the damage ramps, obviously, but it has a 15% chance when it does damage to generate 1 soul shard. That sounds kinda shit, right? But you have to think, there are a ton of instances of this when you have a ton of minions out. Especially if you're running Soul Conduit. In massive AoE scenarios, you will be casting Hand of Gul'dan and hitting Demon Wrath for 1 GCD, and you will be at full shards again and have to cast Hand of Gul'dan once, maybe even twice, 3 times if you're lucky. Hand of Gul'dan will have priority over Demon Wrath all the time. Almost all the time. Unless you don't have time to cast it, I guess. Because it hits really hard. It hits harder than Demon Wrath is going to. As a matter of fact, Demon Wrath actually doesn't even hit that hard at all. It's your artifact ability that procs off of Demon Wrath that's going to do more AoE damage than Demon Wrath itself. And that's called Thalkiel's Discord. Whenever you Shadow Bolt or Demon Wrath, your skull will teleport to the target and radiate a little bit of AoE. That hits harder than your actual AoE ability. So hopefully I haven't been rambling too much. I'll kind of end the video here, and I might make a more in-depth guide on legendaries and maybe do some gameplay in dungeons and raids, because I have the luxury of having every single Demonology legendary because I hate myself and I play Demonology. So hopefully you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you later.